Welcome to Redundancy Matters with me, June Hogan. This is the podcast where I help HR professionals and leaders managing redundancies to put people at the heart of the process. And if you've not tuned in before, it's great to have you here. So I'm a qualified career coach, I'm an outplacement specialist, and I've got a background in HR. And I've been working with individuals and organisations navigating redundancy since 2019. In today's episode, I'm joined by Katie Murray, an experienced HR copywriter with more than 20 years' experience working in HR. And together, we explore something that can shape a redundancy process almost more than anything else, and that is communication. Katie shares reflections from her own experience supporting redundancy programmes, including the moments where communication built trust and also the moments where it didn't. We talk about the pressure line managers can feel. We talk about the importance of flexibility within a process, and also why silence or some of those unclear or confusing messages can often make situations harder for people that are involved. We also explore what good communication really looks like during redundancy, not just getting the legal process right, but making sure people feel informed, respected and supported throughout. So I really hope you enjoy our conversation, and let's dive in. Welcome to today's episode of Redundancy Matters, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Katie Murray. Katie is a HR copywriter with an extensive background in HR. So welcome to today's episode, Katie.
Hello, June. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. So that was a very brief introduction about you and what you do now. But do you want to tell us a bit more about your background, your experience, and what's led you to be specialising in HR copywriting? And then we'll dive into all things redundancy.
Yeah, sure. So the short answer is that I spent 20 years doing HR, mainly in a generalist capacity, some specialist pieces around benefits in particular, before deciding that actually I didn't want to sit in the meetings anymore. And was there a different way that I could structure my day around having what was then a newborn? He's now in school. So I looked at my background in terms of the HR experience that I've got, that'll feed into redundancy and stuff in a minute, but also what I was good at. And actually, I was very often the comms person, the sort of, can you check this over person, and have always had a love of the writing. So that was where the shift into copywriting came from, of wanting to still be very much involved in the HR industry, but with a different spin on it these days.
Yeah, fantastic. And you alluded there that you've got an extensive experience in operational HR, generalist experience, and some specialists. And we'll talk about how redundancy showed up during your career. And I think it's going to be really interesting with this conversation because we can take a look at that through the lens of communication in terms of what you do now and looking back. But the title of the podcast is Redundancy Matters. So tell me, why does redundancy matter to you?
So I think during my time in HR, there are a number of times when I've had to support or I have watched redundancies happening on the sidelines. But actually, the first experience I had of redundancy was while I was on placement as part of my degree. And I was so fascinated by it as a topic. It became the topic for my placement project, almost like a dissertation. I was doing a finance placement. I had a tutor who desperately wanted me to write something about the euro, was not remotely interested in doing that. And instead I wrote about the redundancy process that was happening because the company that I was working for were closing down a site. So that was a 90-day consultation. Then they were making redundancies in the office that I was in. So it formed a significant backdrop to actually my whole placement year because it was announced only a couple of months in, and it formed a lot of what was going on during that 12 months.
So that was really interesting that you had that insight really early on in your career.
Yeah.
And if you think about that experience that you then went on to have in terms of being that HR business partner, supporting line managers, being responsible for the process, I think we can all look back with the benefit of hindsight, can't we? And say there were things that maybe with what I know now, I would have done differently. So thinking about your experience now through a communications type lens, are there any things that stand out for you in particular that you think, if I could have done that differently, I would have done, because communication was a real kind of theme there, maybe where things didn't go well, or maybe things that could have been improved, or the impact that maybe the wrong type of communication, or just the way things are being delivered. Because I think the theme of our conversation today is about comms, but just reflect on maybe some situations where you think communication was at the heart of the process and maybe it could have been improved.
Yeah, definitely. There are a couple of things that stick in my mind in terms of redundancy experience. So I've got one where within the same program, there are sort of two meetings in particular that stick out for me. And one was a gentleman where we had a couple of people in a pool. As part of that, we were going through the consultation process and we were sharing individual sort of breakdowns of what their redundancy payout was likely to look at. And I put all of the details in the envelopes. I thought that I had double checked them. And what ended up happening was that actually the guy who'd been around for a very long time got the details of the guy who hadn't been there for very long. And his concern wasn't that he'd seen that information. His concern was that the other guy might see what he was potentially going to get. You can absolutely understand why that would be an issue for him and why he would be concerned about that. We did manage to stop the other envelope getting opened, but a couple of days later, we have a follow-up meeting, and understandably, he's still pretty angry about the whole thing. It's his private information. And I walked into the meeting and thought, I've got two options here. And it was someone who was showing me very defensive body language, arms crossed, leaning back as far as possible in a I really don't want to be here sort of way. And the first thing that I did was say, look, before we even start today, I want to hold my hands up and apologize profusely for what happened the other day. Thought I checked it. It is inexcusable that I didn't make sure that it was right, and I'm very sorry. And that just those few words set the tone completely for the meeting, and his behavior changed immediately. He was like, no problem, get it. He was very open to then having probably one of the most productive conversations we had, actually, because someone took the time to, because I acknowledged the error and I acknowledged what had gone wrong. And I think when you get into a redundancy situation, sometimes it's really easy to focus so heavily on, we must do this as part of the process, that actually you forget that you're dealing with a person. And that leads me into kind of the sort of the second memory around that, which it was one of those where it was probably the shortest meeting I've had. It was also the worst meeting I'd had. So there are certain times when you are in redundancy scenarios that the person doing the meeting, for whatever reason, isn't the right person to be doing the meeting. Now, technically, in this case, they were, because they were the manager, but the relationship between him and the individual who'd been placed at risk it wasn't a great relationship before we started. And because it was very much around ticking the have I done the right thing by the process box, and there was a very limited sort of interaction with regards to the person involved, I think the meeting maybe lasted 2 minutes, but I actually felt so upset afterwards because it hadn't gone well. There was a lot of anger kicking around in that room. There was a lot of upset. There was door slamming because the person who was delivering the message just in a lot of ways wasn't the right person to deliver it. And I think as HR professionals, we have to stop and think about that. We have to stop and reflect on where are the potential conflicts here? Because with the best will in the world, you can follow the process, but that doesn't mean you're going to get a good result out of it. And the way to mitigate that is to look for those sorts of scenarios where actually you go, this person maybe isn't that experienced, so they might be feeling unsure. They maybe don't have a great rapport with some of the people that they're talking to. So it's then thinking about, so what might happen on the back of that, and how do we try and alleviate that? How do we try and support it perhaps in a slightly different way than we would with this group over here? So yeah, there's a lot around thinking about the broader communication and how that will work for people as you go through.
Two insights there around the process and one level of communication, a written letter that was ended up
Yeah.
in the wrong hands. And having managed redundancy process myself, my heart was literally sinking as you were explaining that, because I can't even imagine what you
Yeah.
must have felt like when you realized that's what had happened. But as you say, you had a choice of how to handle that.
Yeah.
And that point around remembering that this is a person sat across the table from you. What does that person deserve in terms of what do they deserve from you? And what do they need in that moment? And sometimes that can be hard to have that judgment call. But I think when we remember that these are people at the heart of this process, because I guess you could have said, oh, I was producing lots of letters. It was really busy. I did my best. Mistakes happen. Really sorry. But you were
Yeah.
owning that, weren't you? You were owning that because that's what that person deserved from you at that moment.
It absolutely was that. It was like anything else that went out afterwards. I was double checked, triple checked, and did everything I possibly could. But the point was that individual had been massively let down. And he wasn't let down by the process. He'd been let down by me. And I think if I hadn't acknowledged that, we'd have had a very different conversation from the one that we then had. But it's so important to think about the individual that you are talking to. And I've also had circumstances where somebody asked me once, why have you got a template for the meeting? And it was like, you'll be familiar with the process, Jean. So you get to a point in the conversations where you're basically checking off all the things that kind of apply to that individual, right? So it might be about whether they're expected to come in to on site into the office, what access they're going to need to time off, what they're going to have in terms of support, all of that kind of thing. It might be around what happens if they've got. So I've had scenarios where people have maybe got a psychology workload, like what happens in that scenario. It's people have a different combination of things that you need to cover. And I remember somebody sitting there in one of these meetings once saying, why have you got a template? Is it because I'm not important enough? And my response to that was, I have a template because everyone is important. You are important. So is the next person that I'm going to speak to. And while you are unfortunately having this conversation once today, I was maybe having it 5 or 6 times. And once you've said something once, you're like, I know I've said it. Have I said it to the right person? I've got no idea. I know I've talked about it today. But did I talk to Julia about it, or did I talk to Chris about it? You're like, who knows? And I think helping people sometimes to understand that, yes, there is a procedural element of it. And actually, sometimes that helps you to make sure that they have got all the information and they are ironically being treated as an individual by going through a templated process. Yeah, sounds a bit weird when you put it like that. But actually, again, it made a big difference because they were okay. And I think that then comes into the fairness aspect of, okay, so you're making sure that we're all getting the same information and we're all getting the right information.
And that notion of having that template or that script or that structure that you're talking to somebody about, and thinking about that situation where you had that kind of 2-minute meeting.
Yeah.
And being able to combine the kind of, yes, this is what we need to get through. So we need to talk about all of these things. But the way you deliver that isn't just reading out the template, being able to connect with the individual. So these themes, and I'm capturing a few as we're going along here, about things that you build into a communications process that would run through any redundancy process. How would you approach this notion of making sure that whilst the line managers might have all they need in terms of the process, the structure, the documents, the FAQs, how do we make sure that we're better preparing line managers for what at the end of the day is a very difficult conversation for many of them to have? And some of them, and you alluded to it earlier, and I've talked about this with other guests, for some of them, they might not want to admit that this is going to be difficult. They might just not feel that they can. So what advice or thoughts would you have on how we prepare line managers to communicate this stuff in the right way?
I think so. Part of it depends on what sort of manager you've got, right? There are some managers who are naturally quite empathetic. Their style is to go in to try and understand the individual, to build a rapport with them. There are others who are far more process. And I think it, it's a little bit of what I look at with the work that I now do. It's around the audience. So it's looking at who is that audience. And when it comes to prepping managers, it's looking at your audience of managers and saying who needs what. Different people need different information to feel comfortable with what they're doing. So if you've got a manager who is very process focused and actually the people side of it is quite difficult, then you can have an agreement about which bits you'll step in on. It might be, look, if you can take the lead on this and this, then I can help manage this piece for you. Or if you take the lead on that, but I'll support with any questions that come out around those sorts of things. And I think sometimes it's about reassuring the individual that they don't have to have all the answers. And I think that's one of the other things that I've certainly come up against in redundancy is those managers who feel like they can't be wrong, like they do have to tick all the boxes and they have to do the right thing all the time. And that's unrealistic. And actually some of the best sort of outcomes come from those moments where you go, actually, I'm not sure. I want to go and check that. And I will check that and come back to you. And it's the commitment and then follow up on that which makes the difference, not the fact that you didn't know it to hand at the precise moment in time. So I think when it comes to working with managers, it is looking at what do they need. So have they done a lot of this before? What sort of relationship have they got with the people who are going to be in the room? What sort of language do they need to use while they're in that situation? So again, if you've got somebody who you know is likely to try and bluff their way through it, you have that conversation up front and go, look, I know sometimes you like to think out loud while you're doing things. This isn't one of those scenarios because actually that's really unhelpful here. And again, I've certainly had that where you go, the key communication here is making sure that these points get across. Everything else we take out of the room and we go back. Because otherwise you end up with perhaps managers creating more questions rather than answering the ones that are actually being put forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think positioning that up front, as you say, because some line managers, understandably, their team look to them to have all the answers. So you're the one in charge. You must know everything. But in some situations like this, it's okay not to know. And it's okay, as you say, to take it away. Add that to the FAQs list. You're building up material there, right?
So I think, sorry, I was going to say one other thing is I think from an HR perspective, it's also okay for you to be a little bit vulnerable with that manager. And I don't mean sitting there disintegrating, going, oh, I don't know what to do either. But actually an acknowledgement that this can be quite an emotionally draining process. It can be quite a tiring process when you are concentrating, having those conversations multiple times, helping multiple people through a change curve. They, as the manager, has already gone through that a little bit because you've probably been talking to them about it for a week, a couple of weeks, in some cases a couple of months before it all actually happens. They've already gone through that. They put themselves, okay, I'm ready to deal with this now. Let's go there. And they don't necessarily appreciate just how much energy it takes, particularly if they're newer to the process, to actually go through that and walk through through a redundancy. And I've certainly had programs, and I know other HR professionals who have, where you get to the end of a redundancy program and your body just goes, I can release it all now. And you do cry or you have some sort of emotional reaction to it because you're holding on to all of that emotion as you go through it for everybody else and giving them that space. And then you get to the end and go, oh, I think telling managers that sometimes they might experience that is also a really useful thing to do, because it helps them to maybe have the days where they walk in and go, do you know what, I'm finding it tough today. Okay, how can I help support that then? And again, it helps you to then manage that energy when you're in the room and make sure that the focus is in the right place, which is on the individual. And sometimes it means taking a break or calling a halt to a meeting perhaps earlier when you haven't ticked all the damn boxes for the day, because it's not the right time and you need to wait for something else to get processed before you move on to the next bit.
And that's a really interesting point that you make there about having that flexibility within what can seem like, and of course it is, a legally compliant process that you have to work through. At the heart of this, there's the managers, there's the HR team, and there's the individuals at risk. And that point you made earlier about understanding the audience is hugely important when you're briefing line managers to go into this, and understanding who might need something slightly different according to their particular style. But when we think about how we translate that through into the communications that run through the process, thinking about, particularly in a large program, you're going to have a wide variety of people in that audience. How can HR teams they might not have a comms team, this might be them, they're doing it all. How can they make sure that the comms right through from the announcement through to the kind of final letter is really going to land with people well?
It comes back to thinking about who your audience is. So in HR, we don't typically think about it in those terms, but we might think about, we've got an exec board that we need to inform or update on things. What information do they need? You've got senior managers or leaders who are actually managing that process. Okay, so they need some of the kind of business case around it, but actually they also need some of that empathetic language, which helps them to support the process without saying in so many words, I'm sorry this is happening to you, because it's a very fine line. So you can be empathetic around the fact that it's happening. Ultimately, it's difficult to say, oh, I'm sorry this is happening to you, because it's like, that's not an apology, for one thing. And also, how does that help? It doesn't. It's being aware of whether the people that you are talking to, and this applies at manager and an employee level, whether they are process people. So it is thinking about what the message is that needs to get across, and there needs to be an element of all of that in the information that you produce, but it's making sure you've hit those key points. And it's also recognizing that different people might need something else in the meeting itself. I just said, if you've got perhaps a manager who they're having a bit of a tough day, there might be a point where you go, actually, let's have a bit of a break. Let's everybody have a step back from this, because it can be quite a lot to deal with. Equally, there are times when you recognize that an individual might need something else. I have sat in meetings before where somebody's maybe brought a colleague with them. So it's not a union representative, that it hasn't been that kind of environment, or they're not a member of a union, but they have brought a companion with them. And I have made a point of saying, okay, the next thing we're going to do, or as part of this meeting, we're going to talk about the finances, talk about what that means in terms of notice pay and all of that sort of thing. I'm very happy to have your companion here. Equally, if you would prefer to discuss that without them at that point, happy to do that as well, because not everyone wants to sit and share their finances with they might be quite happy to talk about the process and what's happening and get support for, can you make some notes, because I can't quite remember what's going to happen in this scenario. That's different from talking about what money you get. So it's thinking about what are those key elements where, again, you might need that flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so this notion of being flexible, understanding the audience, thinking about the information you absolutely have to get across, and then thinking about how you translate that. And you said something earlier around the planning in all of this. Often HR teams will have been working behind the scenes, getting all of this ready. And I've certainly noticed this when I used to manage redundancy programs, is that when you get to kind of announcement day, there's a sense of relief that it's out in the open, so you don't have to be doing everything
Yeah.
behind closed doors. But also, as a leadership team, you're familiar with all of this information because you've been working on it for a while. And I think it's remembering that the people you're talking to are receiving it for the first time. So is
Yeah.
there anything around how HR teams can maybe take that step back and remember that the comms they're writing, it's all landing for the first time for someone, even if you knew about it a month ago, kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. I think that was one of the key things that came out when I was doing my placement at uni, was around how certain pieces of the communication landed. The office that we were in, like I say, they were going through a program which was a 30-day consultation. But before we got to that, there was a 90-day consultation happening somewhere else. And their view was pretty much, we got told it was going to be a 90-day consultation, and then nothing happened. And we had stone cold silence for 90 days. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, we're back to you guys again. I think the difficulty with redundancy is, like you say, we forget that we've probably been talking about it for a lot longer than some of the people who are involved are. And a void of information actually makes things worse. There's always a concern of, we don't want to say something that we shouldn't be saying, and we don't want to share information, but actually saying nothing makes it worse, and it makes the rumor mill go even faster. So there's a piece around, when you're having that conversation and thinking about the comms that need to go out, it's not just about that first message, it's the follow-up. It's how are you going to have, what information are you giving them afterwards? How are you encouraging them to come to you with questions? How often are you going out with updates on the FAQ? We'd do simple things like, once a week, you'd maybe send out hey, here's the latest FAQs, or if a whole glut of them came in one go, you'd go, I've had a few come in, here you go, this is the latest version. But I think it's very easy to just go, I've delivered the message now. And actually delivering it once doesn't make it land. Delivering it once creates a whole bunch of questions. So it's, how do you encourage those questions to come forward? And it's thinking about what the interim steps are. And it's sometimes the easiest way to do that is to actually think about, if I was in this situation, what would I need? Or not necessarily if you were in that situation, but if my brother, sister, husband, like best mate was going through this, what questions would they have around this? What would they want to know? Because I think as HR, we assume we wouldn't have the same questions because actually we understand the process. Yeah, we do, but it's not the same as going through it. I know you've obviously been through redundancy a couple of times yourself. It's sitting one side of the table is not the same as sitting on the other side.
No.
But it is thinking about, what are the steps in between? It's, are we encouraging managers to check in? Because again, I've known managers go, oh, I can only talk to them if we're in a consultation meeting now.
Yeah.
No, that's not it. No, it's really not it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked with clients who've been going through the process and they've decided they want to access their outplacement support, and they asking me questions, which, and I'm just said, those are the sorts of things you can talk to your line manager about. Oh, I haven't got a meeting for 2 weeks. Well, you go and find them. That's okay. You can go and speak to them.
Yeah, but it is, I think people there's something that happens when a redundancy process kicks in, that whatever informal communication there used to be suddenly grinds to a halt. And actually, that's one of the biggest things I think we talked about. How do you prepare managers earlier? Reminding them that it's okay, that they're still allowed to have their normal relationship with this person. Yes, it will feel a bit awkward because it's going to. They can still have a conversation. And it's saying to them, look, if something comes up specifically about redundancy, the answer to that is, if it's one of the questions that we've talked about here, then you go back and you reinforce that conversation. You repeat what you've already said to a degree. If it's something else, then this is how we handle it. So we want them to still come to you. We want them to still ask you those questions. And it's okay to have those conversations. What's not okay is to commit the company to something that isn't going to happen. So again, it's just going, you can still have the conversation, like you can still go and see them. But if they ask for a meeting with you and you start to err into a territory somewhere else, you can turn around and say, look, I think actually this would be best done in a consultation meeting. Let's do that. I think the other thing is that, and again, it comes back to that flexibility. Some people need 3 meetings. They need one that starts it, one in the middle that tells them what it's all about, and one that goes, yep, that's it, we're done. Other people need 5 or 6. You kind of go, we're going to have three meetings per person or 5 meetings, whatever it is, depending on what the structure is. But you are allowed to deviate from that if you've got somebody who needs something else. It's very easy to get caught up with, they've all had their first meeting, they've all had their second meeting, now we're having the third one. What about this person over here that actually probably needs a couple more?
Yeah, and that notion of being flexible within a framework.
Yeah.
And also, I think, and this goes back to the comms, but being able to share enough information with people so that they can understand the rationale. They might not agree with it. They very well may never kind of come to terms with it, but they at least can understand how you've arrived at this position. And that announcement, the rationale will stay with you through the whole process, and you'll keep kind of going back to it. And I remember working with quite a large organization, and they were making redundancies in different offices across the UK.
Okay.
And I always remember there's one individual, they were the only person at risk in that office, quite a small satellite office. They thought they were the only person at risk in the whole company. They did not know that the broader business was making redundancies in different areas because the line manager, I don't know the reason why, hadn't shared it with them, didn't know, whatever. And when that individual came to work with us, and we said, we've been working with other colleagues, because he said, I'm the only one. We said, we didn't obviously go into detail. Said, we've had other colleagues we've been supporting. It was like a weight was lifted off his shoulders. This poor person felt like he was the only person because the context wasn't there. And so I think that maybe they didn't ask questions, I don't know. But what you said there about making sure that people have got enough information to engage with what's going on, but also try and understand it, because as they leave the organization, they carry all this with them. And it just brought to mind that, and I'll never forget that situation that person explained to us. And I thought that could have been so much different for them if they just had a bit more information that was shared. So that whole, I guess it goes back to the comms plan. So making sure that the packs are there, you've got all the information, that the satellite offices know they've got to go through all of this with everybody.
There's definitely a piece about the particular language that you use. I remembered about a particular scenario we had where we had written something like, we will do a thorough assessment, or it was something to do with the criteria of how we were going to process this particular pool and make a decision on which roles were going. And whatever the specific wording was fundamental to the people that we were putting at risk and who were involved in that consultation process, because they were a group of people where words was their thing. Where we say, I'm saying thorough, it doesn't really matter what the exact phrase was, but our definition of thorough, their definition of thorough, may be 2 different things. They wanted to know, what does that look like precisely? We would see that as being X, Y, Z plus all of these things. And we were like, okay, we were thinking like X, Y, Z, right? So I think, so there's a piece around the language being very important there. But I think we had the conversation of, it was also, there was a bit around the trust that is there. And actually that's something we haven't talked about, which is, what's the existing relationship between whoever it is that's managing that process and supporting that process from a leadership and HR perspective, and the people that you're actually talking to? Because if they don't have an innate trust in you already, it is not going to get stronger by going through a redundancy program with them. And I think what that particular sort of phrasing did was emphasize actually that lack of relationship between the individuals and the management who were running it, the HR contacts who were running it, until we went into those meetings and I was one of the HR people involved. I haven't met a number of those people. I knew who they were. I knew roughly what their jobs were, but that's not the same as having a relationship with them. So they were defensive. They were skeptical. They were looking for every opportunity to go, hang on a minute, why? Where has this come from? What's happened here? And we can forget sometimes that actually as HR, part of our role is to develop relationships before we need them. I've worked with so many different people over the years, and there are some relationships where they start off rocky. I'm going to be honest, like there are a few meetings where you're like, oh, okay. But actually, as you get to know that person, as you work with them, as you understand more about what they need from something, it makes a big difference. And it's those sorts of relationships that have a massive impact on how smoothly or not a redundancy program goes. And when it comes to what happens next, it's also around what happens to the people who are staying behind and what relationship have you got with them and how do they perceive you based on how their colleagues were treated before they left.
Absolutely. That's like the thread that runs through all of this. And what you said there about having those relationships and building that culture, having the psychological safety and the environment where people understand and trust in leadership, so that when hard decisions have to be made, they're still going to be tough for the individual impacted, but there's that connection with what the leadership team, what's happening. And I remember when I was on the other side of the table and the words were said to me, and you naturally go into defensive mode because someone's about to take away your livelihood and all the other things that go with that. And I had huge respect for my line manager, and I'm still very good friends with her. But in that moment, at that time, I was not happy. But for me to be in that position of, hang on a minute, what's going on here? So as you say, you can expect those different reactions, but if you're coming at it from a fundamental place of having a good relationship, treating them as an individual, as you said before, being flexible and really thinking about what does this person need at this moment in time. So this theme that I'm picking up all the way through, and I was making little notes as we were going along, is around flexibility for the individual, flexibility for the process, this notion of, yes, we're working within a framework, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't flex and do things differently. Having that notion of keeping communicating, so not having that void of silence. So a comms plan which has regular touch points in it, being visible, being open to those questions, as you said before, because you want to hear what questions people have got so you can share that with others. So there was loads in there that I was hearing in terms of themes for someone to take away. So if someone listening to this is on the verge of preparing a comms plan for, it could be 3 people, it could be 350. What would be some of your top tips as to how they can make that land as well as possible at that stage in the process?
I think top tip number 1 has to be step back and actually think about it. And I'm not talking about the meetings. We have a tendency to plan the meetings to the nth degree. It's the bits in between. So like I say, it's looking at, are we going to produce an extra resource for people that helps them to understand? Are we doing anything around, if we've got people who are approaching, perhaps considering taking pensions and stuff like that, what other support do we need aside from internal HR? So is that support from, we've had recruitment agencies maybe come in, do sessions around updating CVs. We've had outplacement support for particular roles or particular technical skills where actually it's more difficult perhaps to go and find that particular role and needing a bit more support. People who are actually not quite sure what the heck they're going to do next. So I think there's a piece around those touch points and resources that you make available to people. There's definitely a piece around who your audience is and what they need. So if they're process people, they need to understand what the process is. If they are people, then they are going to need something different because they need to understand what's the impact on themselves or the people around them, family, that sort of thing. And it's looking at what are the key pieces of information we need to get across around them. And this is going to possibly sound like a bit of a weird one, but you also want to think about how do you need the business and the leadership team and the HR team to be viewed when you're done? Because there aren't many circumstances where HR teams are actually making the entire company redundant. You're normally making a pocket of it. It's a program because you need to reduce heads in a particular part of the business, or you're transferring a certain section of the business. So thinking about actually what comes next and how do we embed that, that's as important as the redundancy program itself. And I think for me, that's probably my top tip, because a lot of people think about how do we get through the actual process? They forget about how do we embed the next bit.
So that comms plan that goes beyond the kind of the last day for people. Katie, there's been so much in there that I've really enjoyed unpacking with you, as they say, and looking at it through that lens of what you do now in terms of making sure that communications are clear and that they land well for people, and you've got the messaging right and all of that good stuff that I know you do. And you've done for me in the past, I know you do for lots of clients as well. So if someone listening to this wants to find out more about what you do and get in touch, where can they find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. If you look for Katie Jo HR Copywriter, you'll probably find me. If you look for HR Copywriter, it generally comes up, to be fair. And the other one is on my website, which is katiejocopywriting.co.uk. Those are the two main places you can find me.
Wonderful. And I'll put the links to that in the show notes if people want to reach out and get in touch. Thank you, Katie. I've really enjoyed that conversation, and there's loads of tips and loads of value in there. So yeah, thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.